Hey students, welcome back. This is Torres, Elbow Bump. How are you? Are you doing okay? Is your family okay? Remember, if there's anything I can do to help, please send me an email so that I can try to help in whatever way I can. So lucky you, you get to hear my voice for another lecture. But the best part is, we will be reviewing the general introductory vocabulary and ideas of statistics. Yay! The whole point of the lectures thus far is that it focuses on the vocabulary, terms, and ideas that we're going to need in order to discuss concepts throughout the statistical process. So we're going to need an effective way to communicate moving forward. I have created a document that has the general statistical terms and general concepts in a Google PDF. You will find the link in the description box below. So you can click on that and you'll have a list of all the terms and concepts. These are really important because we're going to continuously use these words quickly in detail and back and forth throughout the rest of the course. So it's really important that you have a very clear understanding of what each of the terms mean. We really started to look at ways to identify possible sources of error in the statistical process and attempting to eliminate that error from the onset so that we can have more confidence in our final result. One of the things that happen in the statistical process and when you're doing any analysis is that there will be some source of error. It can happen from a variety of places. And so just trying to be as precise as we can from the beginning and as careful as we can from the beginning, we can find ways to reduce that error. Before going on to too much more, I just want to take a second to go over the list with you. But here it is right here for us to kind of look at together. Just a lot of stuff that we've been discussing in pretty big detail. Difference between a parameter and a statistic, the population, the sample, random sampling bias, different kinds of sampling, what a variable is, cases are. We definitely will be working with coding as we start looking into our own investigations, our own analysis, trying to distinguish between when something is an observational study and when something is an experimental study. If you would like your own copy, as I said, there is a link in the description box below that'll open up to a Google PDF. I want to start our review by looking at this photograph. This is a photograph, or actually it's an illustration, I should say, of a World War II plane, and all the red dots on this are bullet holes. As the plane was flying, enemies would be shooting at the plane, and when the plane returned to base, these were the areas that you could actually find bullet holes, okay? And the ground crews started to notice that this was a typical pattern in the planes that returned to base. The Allied forces, they were looking at reinforcing their planes and deciding if we are going to reinforce our planes, where should we put additional armor or additional some sort of barrier to help the planes last longer during their missions. This was the question, where should the planes be reinforced? They knew that if you tried to reinforce the entire plane, there would be consequences, right? They could just make the whole plane heavier, put more iron or steel or whatever it is that's going to protect the plane from crashing, but there are consequences to take in mind. First of all, it requires a lot of materials, and during wartime, materials are scarce. If too much steel or any other type of heavy reinforcement is used, then the plane becomes more heavy. When a plane becomes more heavy, the plane will start to use more fuel. That means that the plane cannot fly as far as it usually would because it has less fuel because it's more heavy. And also, another thing that could happen is the plane may become more difficult to maneuver through the air. So if the pilots were trying to get away from the anti-aircraft fire, it could influence of how nimble they could be in the air. As you look at this plane, I want you to pause the video and I want you to think about what is the relationship between the population that the question addresses and the planes that return to base. So the question is, where should the planes be reinforced? What planes? What planes are being referred to in the question? Well, all of the planes in the Allied forces would be in the question. They don't just want to reinforce some of the planes, it's basically all of the planes. What can we do to save as many planes as possible, not just the ones that are returning to base? So as I said, the Allied forces wanted to know how to reinforce all their planes. They wanted as many as possible to come back to base. But the problem is that they had some bias in their sample. The only planes that they had to study were planes that actually survived in their sample. So they weren't getting to study all the planes that they had in their fleet. They could only study the ones that returned, and many of them had this same distribution where the bullet holes were like right here in the plane tips. They were right here in the center of the planes and right here on the tail, meaning that something about these areas being hit still allowed the plane to come back to the base. But if you look at this, well, what's in here? This is where the pilot sits. So if there's too much fire here where the pilot sits, that might hurt the pilot or kill the pilot, and then the plane will crash. There's nothing here on the engines. We can deduct that any plane that got hit in the engines probably crashed because they're not getting any back to the base that don't have damage. The back end of the fuselage was not hit, so maybe there's something here that maybe kept the tail intact. If this would have been fired upon, it would have compromised the plane. And maybe these areas right here, if there was too much fire on these areas, then perhaps one of the plane's wings would have broken off and they could not return to base. So really looking at just the areas where the plane was hit does not give us information about where we should necessarily reinforce them, meaning to say, like, they shouldn't necessarily reinforce the areas where the bullet holes are, but they really should reinforce the areas of where there are no bullet holes, because those are the areas that are likely going to contribute to planes not returning to base, so that they would crash when they actually got hit. What kind of study is this? Well, this is an observational study. There was nothing that the scientists or the experimenters or, the problem solvers in the Allied forces did to get this information. This was just something that happened. They used what they had in order to conduct an observational study. The population for this would be all planes in the Allied forces. And their sample was survivor planes, because all the planes that didn't make it back, they couldn't study. So this is really a convenient sampling ultimately, because they can't just take random planes from different places. They have to take what they have access to. So this is convenient sampling. The variables that might have been included in this type of study were the areas where the holes were. And those are all qualitative, meaning like the tail, the wings, the center area, also the areas that did not have holes. Okay, so these are also qualitative areas because you're naming something. You're talking about a quality of the sample. The survivorship, whether the plane survived or did not survive, again, that's qualitative. The number of bullets might be quantitative because maybe you're looking at different planes to see, well, how many bullets did this one have and how many bullet holes did this one have? What mass of the plane was lost? Something like that you could actually put a number on would be quantitative. So the next experiment I want to look at is one called Robber's Cave. There's a link in the description box below, and if you've opened up the Google Slides that I'm looking at for this, also linked below, you can get a link to this video called Robber's Cave. And this video is specifically looking at an experiment on intergroup dynamics. So I want you to take a second, pause my video, and go to the description box and find the video for Robber's Cave and click on that and watch it. It's a very short video. It's maybe 5 to 10 minutes long. Similarly, if you're looking at the Google Slides, then you can also click on this blue right here and it will take you to the description link. So go ahead and click on that. I want you to go ahead and watch it, get an idea of what's happening with the boys, and then come back so that we can discuss it in more detail. So you should have already watched the Robber's Cave video. As just a summary of the experiment, the Robber's Cave experiment was a very famous psychological study that looked at how conflicts develop between groups The researchers divided 22 boys into 2 groups in a summer camp type of atmosphere, and they looked to see how the children bonded within their groups and the dynamic between the 2 groups, like 2 teams, and also looking to see what the boys did in order to reduce group conflict later on. There was many questions in this particular study. One question was, how quickly can group identity become established among strangers? How quickly will they bond? How fixed or flexible is that identity? Can they start to identify with the other group, or will they stay loyal to their first group? How would the identity play out in a competitive setting with other groups? Finally, how can group conflict dynamic be mitigated afterwards? So once the groups are no longer sort of seeing eye to eye, what can be done to change that? This is an experimental study because this is not something that happened on its own. The children weren't just at summer camp and they decided to start observing them in their natural environment. The scientists or the psychologists in this situation decided in advance that they were going to get 2 groups of 11 boys each, put them in certain situations. The experimenter inserted themselves in the experiment. This is not something that happened naturally. I don't really know much about the sampling. I don't know how these children were chosen, so I can't really speak much about the sampling, but the population is really just looking at people, or at least young people, young boys. What they want to learn in this study is not how these specific boys would interact. They wanted to learn about what's happening in the study so that they could apply it to a larger population, to how people interact. How can they get people to bond? And once they belong to certain groups, how can they get them to work together if their identity is clearly tied to one group? The variables, there's several. There's the groups themselves. One group was called the Rattlers and the other one was called the Eagles. Those are qualitative. The amount of time needed for the boys to bond originally would be quantitative because you're counting time, it's an amount. The group norms, the rules that the boys made, would be qualitative because they're actually naming things, quality about these norms. Instances of aggression, if they were counting up how many times the boys did engage in aggressive acts, that would be quantitative. The types of games or rewards that they received might be qualitative. Now, if they were counting like how many games each team won, that might be quantitative. I'm not really sure exactly how they gathering these variables, but it seemed to me that they were a qualitative variable because of the things that they got. They actually won or they did not win. It was, they weren't keeping a tally of how many. And then the cooperative tasks that they had to do at the end, helping solve the problem of the food, like everybody coming together to work to get the truck out of the mud or whatever it was. In this sample, there were 22 cases, 2 groups of 11 boys. So 22 cases. Every boy had information taken on them. There's probably all kinds of other qualitative stuff like where they lived. They try to keep a lot of things constant, and constant is things that are the same for everybody in the group. So they actually went out of their way to mention that all of the boys were about the same age, so that's a constant. They were all white, and that was a constant. And they all came from similar backgrounds, so that was a constant. What they were trying to do is separate the situation from any other mitigating factors that might contribute to the experiment. Ultimately, if they had 22 cases, and assuming these were the only 6 variables, because I don't know exactly how many there were, but assuming these were the only 6 variables, then there would be 132 observations. I want you to take the time and watch another video. It's one video about 3 famous scientists. The first one is Louis Pasteur, the next person is Joseph Lister, and the last person is Maurice Helleman. In the description link below, you will see a link about these 3 famous scientists and studies that they did. As you're watching this, I want you to continue to think about, like, what is the question? What is the population? What is the sample? What are the variables? And see if, when we meet up on the other side, if you were able to distinguish them. The Google Slides for this presentation are linked in the description box below, but you can also pause the video to check your answers. So I'm not going to read them for you. You can go ahead and pause and read them for yourself, but this is the information for Louis Pasteur. This is the information for Joseph Lister, And this is the information for Maurice Helleman. So that's it for today. Today's big ideas are statistical vocabulary is important, and trying to reduce error on every step of the statistical process is important to make sure that your final results are valid and reliable. With that said, don't forget to check your emails, check Blackboard, do your homework, and subscribe to this channel. Even better, hit that notification bell so you know when there are new videos for this course. Okay? So this is your teacher, Torres, saying stay safe, and I will be waiting to give you a virtual elbow bump in the next video. Ciao!